They said they wanted privacy. But what happens when the truth refuses to stay hidden? When one man, Piers Morgan, claims to know a secret that could change everything. Not about Harry and Meghan, but about their children. A shocking revelation, a furious response, and a royal storm the palace never saw coming. This is the story of how Harry and Meghan lost control.
It was supposed to be a quiet weekend in Montecito. The ocean rolled in and out in patient, indifferent rhythms, and the garden lights around the house blinked like soft truths nobody wanted to disturb. Harry brewed his tea with the sort of meticulous calm that once soothed him in the steward years. Meghan read a letter twice and then folded it again because she could not make it untrue. Outside, the world churned with its own appetite for spectacle. Inside, a family tried to be ordinary. Piers Morgan did not care about ordinariness. He had never been a man to care for half measures. On his program that night, he spoke with the casual cruelty of someone who had fed on attention for decades. He had framed his segments before: provocations, investigations, indignations. But tonight, his words cut differently. He hinted at something that smelled of betrayal, secrets about Harry and Meghan's children that, in his telling, altered everything. He said it without naming specifics, because the economy of insinuation often carries more venom than facts. He asked about identity and tradition, about dual citizenship and hidden schooling, about heritage and what it meant for children born to a world that never stops writing about them. He suggested that the children's upbringing had been arranged as if to shield them from their past and yet to distance them from a future only royalty can imagine. The clip circulated like a contagion. Social media swallowed the soundbite and excreted 1,000 variations. Commentary channels played the segment on loop, each anchor articulating outrage in a new legalistic tone. Opinion pieces bloomed overnight, written by people who had never met Archie or Lilibet, who never watched them braid their mother's hair, who had never seen Harry attempt to steer a shoelace back into its loop. The public, starved for narrative and sedated by spectacle, devoured the fragments and stitched them into 1,000 accusations. Agents of the palace were not slow to respond. If the monarchy moved with the slow, ceremonial grace of an ancient beast, it still possessed reflexes. Calls made at odd hours, whispered directives, the drafting of statements that never left the draft folder. Buckingham's corridors hummed with the low sound of people trying to decide what candor looked like in a world that demanded both truth and theater. Meghan's phone lit up in the small hours with messages from friends who used words like inhumane and reckless. Her face, always so practiced in public calm, crumpled in private. She paced the kitchen island and tried to find the right temperature for outrage that would not feed the fire. Harry paced with a different kind of motion, one of containment and old wounds. He remembered being a target at the age of 5 and marveled in private at how history had a terrible way of repeating itself, learned and then ignored. For the couple, the problem was as simple as it was profound. The children were not props in a public feud. They were small, curious, and tethered to parents who loved them fiercely. Privacy was once a value they fought for. It was now a currency being auctioned to the highest bidder. But the machine of public curiosity did not care for that morality. It only cared for the story. By the next morning, Meghan's publicist issued a statement that read like a line of defense penned in a hurry but with precision. Children should not be targets of public commentary. The statement was clean, concise, and correct, but it did not halt the cascade. Piers Morgan, sensing the heat of the moment, leaned in transparently. He fueled the narrative by dropping unnamed sources, described as close or upset or astonished, which allowed him to keep the tempo high without providing the burden of proof. The newsrooms ate it up. Then the fringe websites, always thirsty for clicks, began to stitch older footage into the new storyline. Clips of Meghan during early interviews, laughing, correcting an interviewer, speaking in the cadence of someone who had learned to live publicly, were replayed as if they were proof of duplicity. A home video of Archie playing under a tree was fodder for analysis about background decor and the implication of foreign toys. Lilibet's first thumbnail smiles were discussed with the fevered scrutiny usually reserved for geopolitical coups. The humanity of children was folded into charts and pundit graphs. Harry's legal team moved in the quiet way that legal teams do. Consultations, cease and desist drafts, warnings couched in firm language. They knew the law could be a shield, but it was not always a sword. A legal battle would consume headlines, but would also drag family minutiae further into the light. Harry weighed the cost of litigation against the cost of silence and of amplified rumor. He once believed the law would protect him. He now understood how it could also prolong the harm. Meanwhile, protesters gathered near the couple's residence, not in numbers to storm the gates, but enough to make microphones twitch. Photographers stationed themselves at respectable distances, and then, when the sun went down, tested those proximities against rules that were more custom than code. The ethical lines blurred in new ways. Would confronting a private home about a public question be defended as the right of a free press or condemned as an invasion of privacy? The debate was academic to the children who slept through the noise and devastatingly tangible to the parents who did not. Royal watchers in London sensed the tectonics shifting. What had been occasional crackling disapproval in the tabloids was hardening into a narrative that suggested the Sussex children might be removed from the picture of continuity the monarchy cherished. Commentators asked whether royal identity could survive its own modernizations and whether the monarchy could absorb a family that insisted on a different definition of belonging. Scholars weighed in, historians scanned genealogies for precedent, and the internet, that modern agora, held its breath and then exhaled in a million hot takes. Piers Morgan did not stop at insinuation. He threaded the moment into a larger thesis about authenticity and spectacle, about how public figures who market vulnerability can inadvertently ask the world to judge the most private aspects of their lives. He framed his revelation as civic duty, the sort of self-assured righteousness that makes conspiracy comfortable. His viewers cheered. His critics argued back. The conversation spiraled. Meghan watched the fallout weave itself into her children's lives like an uninvited pattern. She called old friends and asked how to explain to a child that some people will try to define them before they know themselves. Harry, on the other hand, sat at the desk and wrote a list of things to protect. Passports, school options, play dates with a normal kid from down the lane. The list, a small artifact of practicality, felt like an attempt at reclamation. And yet, the world had already taken its shape. Boomers of narrative and architects of outrage had built a scaffold that would be difficult to dismantle. Piers Morgan would broadcast more opinion pieces. Tabloids would scrawl every conjecture into screaming headlines. The children's names would be repeated like incantations, loud, invasive, unbidden. The weekend ended with the family sitting quietly as the ocean kept doing what oceans do, masking the noise with unassailable continuity. The story, however, was only beginning to spread its roots.
The week that followed Piers Morgan's revelation looked like a country at war with its own reflection. Headlines battled headlines, and every response seemed to generate 1,000 echoes. Harry and Meghan endeavored to reclaim the narrative, to stitch their own version of events that might center the children's dignity rather than the prurient interests of strangers. They scheduled fewer interviews, published fewer photographs, and attempted, with varying success, to let silence become a kind of protection. Silence, however, is rarely neutral. In the age of social media, silence is read as strategy, as guilt, as fortitude. Every absence left a gap that other voices were eager to fill. Piers Morgan and his supporters painted the couple's restraint as an admission of guilt. Opponents argued that the restraint was the only humane option left. Each side amplified the moral frame it preferred. Television networks invited talking heads to parse the earliest interviews and the newest statements. Some pundits, particularly those who preferred spectacle over nuance, spoke about lineage and legacy as if children were chess pieces on a board designed by history. Others, more human, pleaded for restraint, reminding viewers that the subjects in question were minors and should be treated as such. In private, Meghan refused to let the attacks define the day-to-day. She made playlists with songs to sing to Lilibet at bedtime, rehearsed silly faces with Archie to coax a laugh, and fielded calls from childhood friends who urged her to remember the small miracles of ordinary life. Harry, meanwhile, convened a lineup of advisors: legal, security, PR, each with a different calculus. The legal advisors argued for strong action to deter further speculation. The PR advisors counseled measured responses that would not feed the cycle. Security assessed the growing cluster of photographers and the rise in increasingly intrusive questions. A leaked memo hit the press like a stone through glass. The memo, allegedly from a palace aide, cataloged concerns about the potential political implications of the narrative. It included dry notes about international perception, Commonwealth sensitivity, and monarchical stability. Whether authentic or engineered, the memo gave pundits the oxygen they needed to argue that the issue was not merely personal, but institutional. Protests and vigils cropped up in small towns and large cities, some in solidarity with the Sussexes, others in support of those who demanded transparency. The moral geometry of the moment squinted into different shapes depending on where you stood. On one corner, people marched with signs declaring that children must be shielded. Across the street, placards argued that accountability should not be shielded behind private gates. Both sides dove into history books to mine examples that could be used as rhetorical weapons. One afternoon, a friend close to the family leaked a clip from a private gathering where laughter erupted over an ill-fated school play and where young feet charged down a hallway with the chaotic persistence of childhood. The clip, meant for close friends, became another public artifact. The intimacy it carried was cannibalized into hot takes and accusations. The truth, this messy human truth, became a commodity. And then, in the most modern of ironies, the couple's attempts to explain themselves became part of the spectacle. An essay in a major publication, written by Meghan in a candid voice, tried to articulate the philosophy behind their choices: that citizenship was not simply a legal document, but a sense of belonging, that identity could be chosen in part, that parenthood required protection against both myth and malice. The piece was eloquent. It was also parsed brutally on morning shows where hosts argued over the line between personal narrative and public interest. Harry considered the utility of litigation. Lawsuits can be blunt instruments. They can shut down certain conversations and secure temporary victories, but they also summon courtroom lights and relentless scrutiny. He remembered his own experience with scrutiny as a child and tasted the bitter aftertaste of legal action that often prolonged the very thing it sought to end. Choosing to pursue legal remedy would be to fight fire with more fire. Piers Morgan, meanwhile, upped the ante. He held a live panel where he invited experts, some credentialed, others less so,
to discuss the implications of the Sussex children's upbringing on matters of national identity. He pivoted between mocking and cautioning, using humor to undercut the seriousness of his own insinuations. When challenged, he resorted to the old rhetorical shield, free speech. If people were upset, he argued, it was because truth was uncomfortable. The public's appetite did not wane. Podcasts created entire seasons dedicated to analyzing every sentence the couple had ever uttered. Deep dives into genealogy became bingeable content. Snapshots of Archie's toys or Lilibet's outfits were given forensic attention. Strangers debated parenting choices as if they had witnessed the bedtime routines firsthand. Amid the noise, the children lived their small, expanding lives. Archie learned to ride a bike in a private lane while a security detail watched at a carefully measured distance. Lilibet started stringing words together and clapped for herself when she pronounced them correctly. They absorbed in fragments the shape of a world that would not stop talking about their existence. Their laughter carried an innocence that shocked the commentator circuits. Their naps, a stubborn protest against a society that refused to let them be small. There were more practical consequences as well. Invitations that once seemed automatic, family events, personal reunions, casual gatherings, became complicated logistics. Security assessments, privacy clauses, and scanning for ambushes turned what should have been simple pleasures into operations necessitating professionals. Family friends reflected on simpler times when a birthday party did not require rehearsed exits. In London, palace officials convened to decide whether to issue a formal response or to let the matter die down through neglect. They were wary of appearing to intervene in what some factions would brand as journalistic inquiry. Yet the potential damage to the institution, they realized, might extend beyond sensational headlines. Questions of succession, of cultural belonging, of how the monarchy represented a modernized face to the world, all these grave considerations had been refracted through a story about two children. The British press, which had once claimed ownership of every royal narrative, found itself at odds. Some outlets doubled down on aggressive reporting. Others, particularly those who had participated in earlier cycles of intrusion, began to advocate for stricter limits on the coverage of minors. Voices that had followed the tabloids' earlier appetites now argued that there were lines not to be crossed and that a younger generation deserved the dignities of a private childhood. As the months passed, the intensity of the immediate storm softened into a hum, but the consequences lingered like a receding tide leaving behind debris. The family moved homes twice in 2 years, each move carefully orchestrated to protect routine and to preserve anonymity. Their public engagements became sparer and more deliberate. They invested in spaces that felt safe, gardens where children could lose themselves in games without cameras looming above trees, schools with small cohorts and strict privacy policies, communities that resisted the gaze of outside cameras. Piers Morgan rotated to other controversies, as pundits do, and the world found new objects for its fixation. But the architecture he helped erect did not vanish. It remained in the memory of those who had been exposed to the storm. The children grew, and with them a resilience formed not of denial, but of careful curation. Parents who taught them how to be themselves in a world that often mistook spectacle for truth. In time, the conversation shifted toward broader questions: how modern media could be regulated to protect minors, and whether public interest justified the repeated exposure of private lives. Parliament debated codes of conduct for national outlets. Advocacy groups pushed for legislation that would extend safeguards to children of public figures. The debate was imperfect, messy, and slow-moving, but it signaled a societal recognition that curiosity must be tempered by compassion. Harry and Meghan kept living, imperfectly and resolutely.
They took long walks where the children chased after dandelions and where laughter could be heard without microphones. They cultivated friendships that honored privacy. They taught their children to answer difficult questions with truth when necessary, and with silence when that truth would only be a spark to new fires. The world would continue to write about them, to speculate and to judge. Sometimes it would be cruel, sometimes it would be kind. But in the private rooms and the small, ordinary moments, the family reclaimed what the tabloids could not own: an interior life of affection, patience, and the everyday miracles of parenthood. Privacy, once battered by headlines, began to feel less like a luxury and more like a protected right, the kind of right a parent would cross oceans to defend for their child.